thank you to everybody who's made this conference possible. I also want to thank my junior paper advisor, Professor Zaidi, and my two great AIs. They were really invaluable for helping me make a question and write a solid paper. So by way of introduction, the International Monetary Fund acts as a lender of last resort for countries experiencing economic or financial crisis. In exchange for the loans that the fund provides, it attaches conditions on those loans in a practice known as conditionality. A lot of those conditions fall under structural adjustment programs, which focus on macroeconomic reforms, and they might include balancing budgets, opening up capital controls, or reducing state-owned enterprises and the federal or government wage bill. So there's been a lot of criticism for conditionality because of its pro-cyclical nature, the fact that it might hurt poor people and benefit disproportionately the wealthy and multinational corporations. All this drama really escalated during the 1997 East Asian financial crisis and its aftermath, because for a number of interesting political economy reasons, the fund issued a lot of really harsh and austere loan packages to East Asian countries in crisis. So this resulted in a huge popular backlash against the IMF and against conditionality, and actually resulted in a number of East Asian countries and later countries in other regions of the world boycotting IMF programs and creating an alternative to IMF financing through the Chiang Mai Initiative. So in response to all this criticism, the fund adopted a number of reforms to conditionality and its lending practices, to the point where by 2014, the managing director of the IMF, Christine Lagarde, says sort of that structural adjustment, these traditional macroeconomic condition-heavy programs, that's not even in the fund vocabulary anymore. They've fundamentally changed the way that they offer their financial support. So that sort of leaves us as scholars with this economic question, which is, have fund programs been less regressive since the Asian financial crisis and associated reforms? Because the fund's impact on income inequality is a good way to aggregate overall impacts across different types of economic processes. When we're studying the effects of IMF programs, we run into this classic econometric question, which is how do we correct for non-random selection into those programs? Because obviously countries that are facing some sort of crisis and entering programs are going to differ from countries that don't have to enter programs. And for other political and geopolitical reasons, countries that enter fund programs might look different and might have different opinions about income inequality relative to countries in similar economic conditions, but which don't enter into IMF programs. So the way that I chose to tackle this problem was through an instrumental variable approach. Everybody's going to learn about instrumental variables in their econometrics courses this semester, but the neat thing about them is that they help us predict the outcome variable of interest, which in my case is the distributional effect of IMF programs, but they only do so through the independent variable of interest, which is participation in IMF programs and the conditions that are placed on those programs. So just sort of to make things a little bit more clear, the outcome variable that I'm looking at are Gini coefficients on disposable income. The independent variables that I'm interested in were whether a country participated in an IMF program in a given year and some sort of measure for how intrusive the conditionality of that program was, because different programs have different numbers and types of conditions. So I just summed up all conditions on a given program in a given year. And the instrument variables that I used were the IMF liquidity ratio and the number of countries in an IMF program, because it turns out that when the IMF is flushed with resources, when it has high liquidity, it's more likely to give a program to a given country, and it's less likely to attach conditions on that program. So that sort of served as my relevant and exogenous or theoretically exogenous instrument. These are my equations. I'm not going to really go into them now because of time reasons, but they're there. As for results, the first result from my paper were sort of validating the relevance and exogeneity of the instruments. So relevance means that they actually help you predict what you want to predict, which is IMF program participation, and exogeneity meaning that the only mechanism through which they influence your outcome variable of interest, Gini coefficients, is through your independent variables of interest. Because I was able to over-identify my model, I was able to perform a test for exogeneity, but again, those details aren't super important right now. In terms of main results, what I found were that if we look at the effect of programs independent of conditions, those programs and those loans reduce income inequality by somewhere around 2 points on a 100-point Gini scale. So that makes sense because the loan itself is stimulative and might be good for the lower ends of the income distribution. If we look at the effects of conditions independent of the loan, it turns out that more conditions leads to a less progressive and more regressive outcome. So that also makes sense with our economic theory that a lot of these conditions are austere and regressive in their effect. Sort of anomalously, my results indicate that the average IMF program actually reduced Gini coefficients. So it's not really typical in the existing literature on this topic, but I think it's an important lesson that you might get atypical results for the first parts of your questions, and that's okay, but you can still go on to continue to ask interesting questions and make a contribution to the literature. So in terms of my more specific question about whether the effects of IMF programs have changed over time, what I found were that after the 2001 period, the effective conditions were actually less regressive than before the period, so that the difference between an average IMF program before 2001 and after 2001 was that after 2001, the average program reduced Gini coefficients by about another ½ of a point on that 100-point scale. So the implications of my findings are that it's tentative evidence for the institutional change theory that Director Lagarde was speaking about earlier, that in fact policy and practice has changed to the degree that there are different outcomes from those reforms. And it's also an affirmation that if the IMF wants to maintain its credibility as a lender of last resort, it should continue to move in this direction of reform, making conditionality less regressive, and that might entail including more poverty reduction conditions on its programs, including social service spending floors as a condition on its programs, and relying less on macroeconomic reforms which are associated with austerity.